My guest today is Bhagwan Thacker from the Empowerment Foundation. Bhagwan grew up in Anjar, moved to the US at an early age in the 70s, and has been giving back to India over the last few years. While Bhagwan himself will say he's a fairly new giver, he's evolved tremendously over the last couple of years, and will talk about being more equitable and participatory to the communities he serves.
Okay, good. Well, first of all, thank you, Tack, for coming to India, spending time with us. So I think today's conversation, I thought it would be good for the listeners to understand a little bit about your journey in terms of where you grew up, how you came to Mumbai, where we're doing the interview today, and then what took you abroad.
Well, that's a question that's obviously would be a very long answer, but I'm trying to be brief. Born and raised in Anjar, Kutch, Western region of Gujarat. So I'm Guju. I was blessed with wonderful parents who supported me to go to college. I was one of the first kid in the town to go to a college out of town. And I went to Saint Xavier's in Ahmedabad, which was a wonderful college. And somehow I was told that engineering was the best thing in the world, especially chemical engineering. And thing to do in those days, the visa system in the US had been relaxed a couple of years prior. So go to US. So I would say more than half of my classmates went to US. So that was just the path everybody had chosen. And I was obviously ambitious, wanted to make good money so I can then hopefully do some good for my family and the world. So went to US in 1971. So that was, 54 years ago, pretty much about this time of year in January 21st.
No, I know my parents had a similar journey. And as you said, so many Indians left around that time to go to the US. And if you can talk a little bit about your first sort of career that you had, what you were doing, and what led you to start your own business.
Well, I studied chemical engineering. At that time, the only information I had about that was the most difficult. You had to have the best grades. You had to be in top 2 in your state university to be admitted to Bombay University's chemical engineering program. So stupid me thought if I have to be so good, it must be a very high-paying job and more fun career for me. Sad to say, after I went to US, I never went to a chemical factory. Nobody ever talked to me about what I would do, what my salary would be, and how it is viewed. And lo and behold, I discovered to my chagrin that just as I was graduating, that I wouldn't make as much money as I was making as a waiter working part-time 2 nights a week. So that seemed like a very bad thing to do. So I said, this is like almost injustice. What can I do? So I asked people around and they said, well, you can do an MBA, which was out of the question. I didn't have money, no scholarship, or go in sales. Career I hated with passion before I went in sales, and I still kind of don't like it. But I looked around for jobs with chemical companies in chemical sales, and they all said, well, look, you are probably interviewing in sales because engineering jobs are scarce right now. US was in biggest chemical industry recession in its history at that time. So then a friend of friend, lucky me, suggested you should apply at IBM. I knew nothing about computers, never seen one, never touched one. And now I would be applying at IBM. But he said, IBM hires anybody. They wouldn't be intimidated because you have masters in chemical engineering and you're going in sales. They even hire people who are PhD in physics. Okay, let's try it. And lo and behold, I got the job and made good money. But working at IBM, I learned a lot about businesses, small businesses particularly. And my father, like most Gujarati, is a merchant businessman, passed away, but at that time he was. So I had business in my genes. So when I saw a first opportunity, I jumped at it, and rest is history.
And if you can talk a little bit about the early days of starting a business, this was in the mid 70s now.
It must have been difficult for an Indian American, newly immigrant, to start something new. How did you decide to sort of leave IBM and to start something on your own? And what led you to that?
Well, a lot of my early success could be attributed to that friend recommending going to IBM and working for IBM, which I did very well, fortunately. You were almost white coated, and so you were part of them because that was the most elite company at that time. Like today, it's Apple or Google or Facebook, but IBM was world's most profitable company, 7 years running at that time, and was highly respected at 80 or 90% of the worldwide computer market, not just US, Japan, India, all included. So that was just a nice little background to have. And because I had computer background, I went in computer related business that was somewhat connected with IBM's customers. So it was starting at a sort of an easy path, working with my existing customers and working to sell them on idea of computer leasing of all things. And US starting a new business, even for anybody, there are hardly any restrictions whatsoever. I mean, you just ask a lawyer to incorporate you, and next day you have a company and a business. Now you just have to have money and make money. So I'd saved a few dollars working at IBM. I made good income there, and I used that to get started.
And how many years did you run this company?
I just sold the last company. I went through iteration of businesses, but the final company that I had been working on for the last 35 years, I just sold it last year because I was turning 75 and I thought it was time to retire and devote my life to doing something more valuable. My foundation was growing rapidly thanks to Dashra, so I thought this was a very opportune time. People say I'm retired, but I'm really not retired. I'm full-time Dashra extension in US.
No, I think once you're part of the Dasra fold, you have to be full time and more, as you've seen in the last few weeks with our schedule, as well as all of the work we've done before your visit to India in the last couple of years. If you could talk a little bit about what was your experience in giving, both in the US and in India, sort of for the first, from the 90s, let's just say onwards.
Yeah, I created my foundation in 95 to fulfill my commitment that I had made to myself. I didn't announce it publicly. I'm not a very public speaking person. So it was giving 90% of my net assets. And I was saving 90% of my net income going forward once I started to do well. Obviously started with what a lot of funders do that I think was not a best thing to do, but at least was a start. I wanted to start working in my hometown where I had seen extreme poverty. Not to say there wasn't poverty elsewhere, but Anjar, Kutch was particularly more backward, even in Kutch, which was considered very backward then. So I started. Nobody in my family, they're very wonderful people, but had worked in any kind of a charitable organization, and there wasn't much of network, if you will. So I worked with some of those towns' leading people who were active in some public good work. And I struggled for literally almost 8 or 9 years, went through various iterations, various proposals. And I must say, it was much harder work, much more painful work than anything I had ever done in my life. I kid you not. It was very painful. So people I was meeting with, they were really trying to, and what can I get from you? Because you must be an idiot to want to give away your money to people you don't know. So that was the attitude. And I must say, I hate to say this, being an Indian American, because I love India very much and dear to my heart and soul, that India's charitable landscape is still quite patchy unless you meet something like Dashra. Like, in India, very wealthy people don't give much of their money versus US people, like, lots of rich people give big chunk of their assets to charity. And it's considered a good, smart thing to do, not just a nice thing to do. It was just a very, very frustrating journey till I met Lashra a little over 3 years ago, and my life has changed for very good.
But when you were going in this journey, like you were saying, in the mid 90s, your family that was living here were not necessarily exposed to the sector. And I say that because my first volunteer stint I did in India was in 96. And it was here in Mumbai with an organization called the Community Outreach Program. And we would work with communities that lived in and around Grant Road Station and took these kids to a day school in Kamatipura, which is here in Mumbai, probably better known as a very old and established red light district of Mumbai. And I just remember my family, Mumbai-based family at least, was like, you can't go to these areas. What are you doing? This is crazy. That's where, there's greater crime or greater poverty. And they really thought I was ridiculous and would get cheated. And so I guess along those lines, even though you were giving money, what were some of your initial reactions from your family members here in terms of focusing on charitable giving? Because in 95, wealth creation hadn't happened really as much in this country. Therefore, philanthropy wasn't as big, I would say. So what were their views? Because I know my parents' views and family's views are I'm crazy.
Yeah, obviously. They're very mellow people and not try to interfere. And I was sort of the golden boy in the family. So hardly anybody, sad to say, but I can be very tough. And so nobody liked to challenge me, but I could see it on their faces that why the heck are you doing this, And I have one family member who is the least charitable of all people I've met, who just said, why don't you give money to us? We need money. And of course, didn't need money, and I'd given them enough to live a happy life. So yeah, it wasn't supportive, but they didn't oppose. They're basically maybe not a nice thing to say, but they're probably intimidated by me and what success I've had, how well I did in school. So I guess in Ando Mekana Raja, I was the Raja in my family.
And you were saying that time period was also quite painful. A lot of people who listen to this podcast may be newer on their giving journey. And so if you could maybe give examples of what were some of the things that were painful, and in hindsight, what do you think were incorrect perhaps of even those pathways versus what you're doing now, which hopefully is not as painful anymore.
Right. No, it's a pleasure now. It's fun, exhilarating. But yeah, some of the things were people. So one of the things, as an example, was building a new hospital somewhere in the area. And the moment these people heard through grapevine, I got 3 or 4 competing proposals. None of them made any sense, and they seemed to be scatterbrained and didn't have any idea. And all I can see is they were looking for how they can get some money out of it. So I said, why don't you guys work together? I said, I'm really not impressed by each individual one of you, but all 4 of you groups could work together because this is a fairly big project. Would have been in Anjar, one of the biggest charitable project at the time. But they would absolutely start bad mouthing each other. And I could just tell, just common sense that they were just hustlers, if you will. And some of the smaller donations I agreed to, or actually one was a very small amount, 4 lakh rupees, maybe in 95, it wasn't that small. This guy took the money and it was supposed to be a matching grant, but he convinced me that I should, because I was going back to the US, I came every year, give me the money now and I'll get the matching grant. So a year later, I said, where's the matching grant? He said, we didn't get any matching grant. I said, okay, then give me my money back. And I didn't get my money back. I said, it's spent. So it was, obviously highway robbery, stealing from me. And it was just sad to see it was not a big amount of money for me, but to just see that it could be that difficult and to start and work, so 2 projects that did succeed. One was a school that I funded and a blood bank that I funded that was fairly good size for the area. It was really for the whole Kutch region because the nearest blood testing center from Anjar was about 120 miles away, which was like 10 hours drive in those days. So that worked out. But even then, there were lots of, you know, not get promises. I said, I'll give you this much money, but then you have to keep operating it. Don't operate it in deficit. I suggested, like being a businessman, give the free blood testing for poor and needy, but then charge market prices for people who are able to pay. And they were just not managing it. And they just thought I was the sugar daddy and had given $300,000 up front. So they kept asking for money. And fortunate for me, I by then had been sort of stung by too many. So I said, no, I'm not going to do that. Although I really was prepared if it ultimately failed. But fortunately, it succeeded. So I was just very lucky.
And in the 90s, when you found it difficult in those painful times, was it a similar group of leaders or people from the community that was pitching you ideas when you first started in 95 and you had these experiences? Or were there a different group of people in terms of, like you just said, their understanding of the community, their track record, their ability to think beyond certain things? I mean, I guess what was different about those proposals and those conversations you had in the 90s compared to what you've been having now?
Those people indeed were from the community because that's the only people my family could find for me. So I really didn't work with anybody outside the community. So in that regard, so it was pretty obvious. Now looking back at the time, I was saying, well, if this is the best we can do, we got to struggle. So being a stubborn businessman, I kept persisting, although if I had been smart, I would have walked away the first time. Even the one that is reasonably successful, the school and the blood bank, were the local guys and people who had done it, and at least half of them were seriously committed to doing the right thing.
No, and I think that's really important because I feel, especially with NRIs, they leave for a variety of reasons, primarily economic growth, especially in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, were far greater in the US than here. Things clearly are different now, thankfully. But in their sort of journey of giving, they end up going to their family that they know they trust, but may not realize that their family has little, if any, exposure to the sector. And then you may get well-meaning individuals who are creating ideas because they see money coming their way, versus I think a lot of the groups that you've been supporting have been operating for many years, even decades. And therefore, is it safe to say they're just more grounded, both in terms of the challenges as well as the solutions versus the people that you met earlier?
Yeah, I say that, very good point. None of them had operated an NGO. They were just people in the town, bankers, lawyers, doctors. So they had no experience. They're sad to say, as I was whining about Indian giving, not very great. Kutch is somewhat worse in that regard. It's not what I'll call most enlightened community in the world. So there really wasn't an NGO. There was like one lady who was an ex-retired teacher but her charity would amounted to $100 a year. I mean, she was spending her own money on doing good. So she was definitely sincere and good, but she couldn't expand. So her capacity to do any more, if I gave her money, was not there. She was just doing the best she could. And so there was no established NGO. There were, I should say, maybe I'll correct myself. So being American Indian, I turned to Rotary Club, Anjar or Gandhidham, and Lions Club. So yeah, those were people who were, but they were, donating money, taking money from funders and donating money for projects. The only project I could get them to tell me about was build a hall. And of course, being American English speaker, I don't know what the heck hall is. Or what are you building a hall? Well, that means an office building where they can have nice, cushy, brand new building. And of course, they have vainly thought that I would like my name on the building, so that would really appeal to me. And I'm one of those characters who doesn't like my names on the building or be recognized or given kudos for doing good work. I like to do it as anonymously, quietly as possible. So that's all they could say. And I did actually give very small amount to an ambulance service in Anjar because there was no ambulance in Anjar. And that never came to pass. That's one of the wonderful thing about NGOs that have been operating successfully in India compared to NGOs that I met in the US. They are unbelievably frugal, very, very cost conscious. And as a businessman, I always think I want my dollar, my limited amount of funds to benefit the most worthy, needy individuals as possible. And so I thought I made my money in US, so maybe I should give something there. But that was also very, very not nearly as bad as experience in Anjar because there were established NGOs and so forth. But they were highly inefficient and not very organized toward the kind of data tracking and follow-up and efficiencies that Indian NGOs that I have been working with the last 3 years.
And I think as you went on this journey, if you can speak a little bit about what the education was like, what your education was like in terms of understanding this sector, listening to organizations and leaders on the ground, because many times business leaders who have been extremely successful in building some of the top businesses, which is how they've acquired wealth, they feel that automatically they can just go into philanthropy. And like you said, maybe at times how your family treated you, they were sort of the golden boys, so they can do the same here. I guess changed your mind to start learning. And if you can talk a little bit about the weekly calls, where you were on those calls and how your mind started to shift, because investing in the NGO sector and making grants, I feel at least, is the same as investing in the for-profit sector. One needs to be trained on how to do that better.
Yeah, no, certainly I would say one thing I thought they should teach a mandatory class in high school or college to learn this because it is a very, very different sector. So as Devil, you correctly said, just because you are successful, even in one business, you can't just go in another business. So if you are successful in wholesale and go in retail, you have to really retrain your mind. I try not to be arrogant that I made it here and I can make it anywhere, but I'm also a self-confident person. But yeah, it was something, had I thought what I was going to go through for 20 years, I would have taken a class or taken some training or, work at an NGO, about an organization like Dashra, if I had found one. Don't get me wrong, I speak business language at times, so there are some business principle like Economics 101 does apply, but they do that. They do far better job than most businesses I know. But that's because I've been blessed for the last 3 years with good NGOs to work with. Good understanding, good explanation of what they do, having someone go and research those organizations, their background, their leadership, the actual work they've done, their track record and their financials and so forth is very, very important and something you don't think about when you are a businessman. You look at different things like P&L and profit margins and things of that nature. So it's very different territory, more rewarding than business, but it's definitely something that you really have to be humble and keep an open mind to listening to people. So having this, weekly calls with Dashra team, they were usually preceded by an attachment, detailed description of the NGO leaders we were going to speak to, what work they have done, what their plans are. And I kept an open mind, and I've come a long way from not trusting either intermediaries or the NGOs to trusting the intermediate, in my case, Dashra, and the NGOs. That's the latest chapter in my journey was like rebuild India. And when I first heard it, whoa, this is what I was exactly told my advisor in US, that you should always have a project plan defined and budget and so forth. Don't just give money, plan was for rebuild. I thought, okay, I'll dip my toes in it a little bit and give some money and see how that works out. And as I learned more about meeting some of the NGOs that were supported by rebuild, and I was just wowed. And it was like seeing the light, I guess. I was in darkness, and I was saying, these people are so much, from the community. They've had firsthand experience of pain and agony. I mean, one of the lady, I think, was from scheduled caste, not a lot of education necessarily, not a lot of money, but she was just very powerful personality, powerful speaker, very dedicated, and very, very impressive, very smart. If she goes in business for herself, she'll be a millionaire any day. She had passion in her heart and soul, and all the people that I met with, and very knowledgeable about what they were doing. They had clear vision, and of course, the track record that also helps very much to fund somebody coming to India. For the last 50 years, I come to India for 1 week, go to Anjar, spend all the time with my family, and not even leave the house most of the times. Just so family can visit me, but I'm spending a whole week in Mumbai to again see the work on the ground and see Dashra's organization and meet with the people. And it's been exhilarating. It's been only a day and a half or so, but very happy that I made the decision. And so learning is key. Keeping an open mind is the key, and finding the right people, at least when you're getting started, to work with.
And you, last week, you were saying that you spent time in Kutch, meeting leaders, going to communities, hearing about the work that they've done. Can you talk about one or two stories that you heard from the community or the leaders in terms of them doing things that you never could have even imagined?
Well, one project was one that I was fairly skeptical. These were CWAS is the organization's name. They are experts in water and sanitation. And having been brought up in Kutch, where there was huge water scarcity when I was living there, the water has made it slightly better, but still a huge issue. Innovative ways to get water, just drill holes and wells and deeper and exhausting the resources. So the CWAS professors and experts suggested a project because I was insisting on doing something in Kutch, which is, again, I'm trying to grow from there. They took me to two schools and they started as a demonstration project. So hopefully then local community and government can pick it up because it's a very smart thing. It was rainwater capturing technology, sort of cutting edge in terms of conservation and resource development. And there were 5 little girls who had been the project leader from the start to beginning. They were trained into this, and they were the ones who were describing the project. So it was the most heartwarming experience I had, of seeing these little girls. I knew when I was 12 years old, boy, I was relatively blessed to be a smart kid. I didn't know all these things. I didn't know about what all this is, but they explained, how water shortages are, how they capture the water. And by George, it was in action and it was working successfully. And I guess one of my intermediary, I guess, was that I funded NGO who was working with others that I was most skeptical about. But, because hey, these are university professors, how do they work? But one of the things they do is they're very respected by the governments and so forth. So if they do something, people would listen. They have access to the mayors of the cities or collectors and so forth, and they can get cooperation. And that's very important because in the long run, something like this is really government's responsibility and in their interest to do that because it benefits people a lot. Water is much more important even than food, and very, very scarce in Kutch, and they've done that. So it was very beneficial, affirmed for me one more time that I was on the right track. And I'm like that. Even though I'm on the right track, I always say, hey, am I doing the right thing? Actually met with another little girl also, and this was also seemed like another, I should say, there's a second project that I was like, wow, this is sort of crazy. And it was Balika Panchayat. So here was this little girl. She was elected to be leader. She ran for the leadership and she got elected, and she spoke very fluent in the ways of the world of what they were doing and described. And you can see that this was not a show. I mean, she was knowledgeable, answered questions, and you can see the confidence in her that, this little girl in a very, Anjar is small and rural. This was even a smaller town of 800 people. And here we are. This little girl is speaking fluently about being head of the panchayat or Balika panchayat. Was pretty impressive.
Yeah, no, and in that visit, that same girl talked about in the parents' home, there's a nameplate which only has the father's name.
Right, right.
And when they get married, it'll be the husband's name. And how can a girl or an individual feel self-worth when their name is never seen?
Right. I mean, that's, at least in Gujarat, the tradition is the wife takes father's name as, so daughter takes father's name as middle name and then husband's name. And many a times the husband's family changes the first name even, as was custom in Kutch 55 years ago when I was there. I don't know now how they do it, but yeah, I mean, women have been truly marginalized worldwide, I would say, but not as much as in India and perhaps Africa and places like that. And they have extraordinary capacity. And generally, in my business, I tended to hire more women than men, not because of equal opportunity. They were just better, and they were just really wanting to prove their self-worth. So in India, it's even much more important. So yeah, that was a wonderful thought, and they came up with all that. And it's nice to see creativity in trying to overcome some of the barriers that have been built over thousands of years in our society. Incredible progress with very low expense or effort, if you will.
No, and I think that was also an indication of when you trust the community to come up with their own solutions, they'll be far better than what we would ever think of because we're not in those positions. They'll be frugal, they'll be efficient, and these girls now feel recognized and heard, something that one may not be able to put a price to it because it is literally priceless and may not show up in a donor reporting. But to your point, the enthusiasm that they spoke about, and I remember she spoke about how her future goals was to be a prime minister of India.
Right. No, that's a good reminder. Love to hear somebody say that, which really shows the level of self-confidence. In fact, I think one of my reason I got my job at IBM, they asked me in the interview, I was obviously an immigrant, and those years Indian immigrants were rare in America, and getting a job in sales where you have to communicate with a lot of white business owners and managers they asked me, so what's your ambition? I said, well, I want to be president of IBM. And they said, how soon? I said, maybe 5 years. That was a bit ambitious, but I did, make it. But they hired me despite not having the budget to hire in a big company. That's a no-no. But they were just saying, this boy, we can't let him go.
No, thank you, Tak. And as you look forward now, like you said, you've been very, very active in giving. This has become your full-time job. What are some of the things that give you hope in terms of the next 5 to 10 years and what Empowerment Foundation can do and what this means for you individually in terms of your life journey?
Well, I obviously reaching a goal that I'd set in 95 of annual giving and pretty close to that. And obviously I like to exceed and give more because I'm very encouraged by what I see. Number of people that my small amount of money can help. So it's been very encouraging to see the whole sector progress almost as rapidly as the industry in India has progressed. So it's a wonderful time to be in the giving mode. There's a lot more structure to it, a lot more organization to it, and a lot of wonderful NGOs in just about every kind of vulnerable people or issues like water, and they're all knowledgeable, committed, and have been doing it for years and years. So there's a great deal of selection. So yeah, it's been very nice to see. I would obviously like to see my Indian brothers start to give a little bit more.
And so I guess my last question is really, what advice would you give to funders, given you've gone on your own journey of unlearning and learning? How can somebody get the most bang for their buck and create the most impact in the Indian NGO sector?
Well, obviously, do your homework, work with people who are trusted and established, who have been doing this for a while, So, as in business, we would, starting something new, we go to an expert consultant or someone who has been doing this for a while. So, it's very important to engage something like that and be prepared. You're not just writing a check, you are going to really want to spend some time, and that actually is very fulfilling for your heart and soul to be able to do something like this. So I would say give with open heart and mind, but also do your homework first.
Thank you, Tak.
Thank you for listening to No Cost Extension. Go to dasra.org for more details.